it. Well, it's a few minutes before start time, so we'll give folks a bit of time to log on. And if anyone has questions or feedback or things they want to show off in the meantime, we got a couple minutes.
I did want to ask if you have any suggestions for rose cut stones. Can you give us a source?
Yeah, there's a few places that I buy from that I really like the cleanness of the cut they do, because I'm not a fan of the ones that are really sharply cut. I like ones that have slightly blunted facets. And Rosie on the Rocks is one of my favorites. However, you have to watch their Facebook and Instagram because they post stones that they post them about every 2 or 3 weeks, and they're gone within minutes of posting them. And then my other
R-O-S-E-Y or R-O-S-Y?
Rosie on the Rocks. It's related to it's the husband of the husband-wife team behind Rosie Revolver. I think it's R-O-S-I.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, Rosie on the Rocks. Maybe it's R-O-S-Y. And then what's the other? There's a gal that is amazing, but you have to like know the secret password and then get the secret list of prices from her, and then she set of stones for you. I'll have to dig it up. I'll post it. I may have posted it up on the Facebook group. So I'll dig it up afterwards if
thank you.
I can. Anybody else have good sources for rose cut? And if you have them and you want to post them in chat, feel free. I've only just started. My latest collection is the first time I'm using them heavily. I wasn't an early adopter of the rose cut, but it works really well with my latest collection, so I'm enjoying it. I like non-traditionally cut stones myself, despite going through a whole bunch of traditionally cut stones for this project. And let me post a couple of links while I think of it and hit my record buttons. So in case you missed the first 2 sessions, I did manage to get them both edited. 2 has a sort of a weird little blip in the middle because of the outage that we had during that call. But I was able to edit a little bit around it, and you didn't miss anything because I reiterated what I was covering. And then here is the Facebook group. If you have not joined that and you would like to, that has a lot of documents and other things in it that are useful, and chat about projects and how you're succeeding. And then if you're interested in my actual full-on classes, get all these links out of the way, and then we can reiterate them at the end if people want them. And then my Instagram, if you are interested in seeing what I'm working on over time. Any other questions while we give folks another minute to get connected? Okay. Well, I'm going to show off what we've done to date. For anybody who missed the first 2 sessions, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And there are links to the YouTube videos of the first 2 if you need them. This is a participate as you want, communicate as you want. We just want to sort of work our way through the book, or I'm working my way through the book. What you choose to do of the exercises that I'm doing, totally up to you. I will always try at the end to give you a heads up on what I expect to do in the next session and the approximate materials I'm going to be using, just so that you can get a feel for it if you want to really play along at home. And let's get it going. I'm going to spotlight myself. And I would encourage you, with the numbers we're getting in terms of total number of people, pipe up. It helps me understand that you're seeing what I'm seeing and hearing what I'm seeing. If I'm on the wrong camera, or if you have a question in the middle of something, don't hesitate to ask. So far, the only thing I've discovered that I don't do well when I'm also talking on these processes is cutting a straight line. So if I'm sawing, I may not answer you right away. And if anything is out of focus or needs extra attention, or you'd like me to repeat something, that's okay too. The only thing I'll ask is that you not ask questions about later projects in the book yet, except for if you have a tools question at the end or something, if you're trying to prep for it. So you're welcome to work at your own pace. I just want to keep my focus on the projects I'm on at the given point in time. Let's see. We are recording, which is, I'm just going to my checklist so I don't forget the links. And I just need to pop my graphics into place and then we're good. Should do it. Oh, maybe not. Bear with me a sec. I forgot one of my setup steps. Okay, there we go. What I want to do to start is just go over what we managed to accomplish so far. I have done some polishing, since you all don't need to watch me file and polish unless you decide that's important to you down the road. So I'm going to switch over to look at the projects we've done so far in their nice shiny state. The very first thing we did was an oval, I don't remember whether we did the round or the oval first. We must have done the round first. We did a round stone with a basic bezel. So very traditional, flat backed. I'm gonna pop the stone out of here, but it's a nice clean fit. So it's a little snug. So just back plate and walls and cutting away to give it some cleaning access. John likes to have space that you can get to the back of the stone in case you need to clean it. So this is a very straightforward standard bezel. I talk about this kind of bezel as a jumping off point to a lot of other things because it is, it's the basis of lockets, it's the basis of hollow forms, it's the basis of all kinds of things. Once you've gotten comfortable with the idea of building walls and a flat back, then this is the basic bezel to go to. Hello to everyone that's saying hi, and if you want, share where you're from, because I'm kind of excited about how broad our audience base is for this. The second bezel that we did was a heavier gauge version of that. So the first one was done with 22 gauge walls and a 22 gauge back. This one was done with 18 gauge walls. And the thing that we touched on that's important is the filing of the wall down, not to a sharp angle. That was my learning bit on this that I hadn't been reading up on carefully enough, but to like 2/3 of the wall so that you've got a flat surface on top. When this gets set, I'll be not only pushing in, but also hammering down from the top along that flat wall. So again, cutting away the back. Oh, this one's a really snug fit. So it's a standard bezel. You could have done a decorative cutout. You can do anything you want on that, but it's a nice solid look to the bezel. And you can go heavier gauge if you want. I just don't necessarily have the muscle strength to really set that. And the one that got away last time because I wasn't happy with the fact that my seam in the inside had a small crease in it, so I've redone it. This is our first shoulder bezel, which we did with 22 gauge walls and 24 gauge interior. So I redid one to my satisfaction, and it does not have the seam break. I will point out one of the most important things when you're doing this 2-layer version is that you get your solder thoroughly enough in there that when you've sanded and filed it down and polished it up, you can't actually tell that there are 2 layers to it. So that's the make it look snazzy version. So that's for the faceted stone, but it could just as easily be sitting a cabochon in there, and 24 gauge is the minimum you need on that inner wall, according to John. This one, I had left it a little bit high so I could trim away. I would not set this with so much lip from the top coming over, but it's always easier to take it away than it is to put it back. So to get it nice and smooth and flush, I'm going to trim that down before I set it. So that's what we've done as projects thus far. Any questions on that? Chicago, Oregon, San Francisco, Lafayette. Cool. People from all over. Lafayette, East Bay, is that California? Washington State. Nice to see people from all over. Any questions on those 3 projects that we've done? Okay.
Nope.
Oh, go ahead.
That was a no.
Oh, okay. I am going to go ahead with, when we left off last time, we were talking about doing the other version of the step bezel, the shoulder bezel, which is using a wire frame on the inside instead of a wall. So I'm going to do a round stone. I'm using a 22 gauge outer wall and an 18 gauge square wire. John's book points us at either square or round works. He likes the round because it automatically gives a little slot for the solder to flow into. I personally like the square because I like the look of it from behind. It seems crisper and cleaner to me. I don't personally like the little curve that shows up under the stone on the back side if you're looking at it from that, but it's your choice. Again, you don't need to go as heavy as 18 gauge. I just happen to have some, and I like the heft of it relative to the stone that I'm setting. So this is essentially the same things that we went through with the oval bezel, in that we're going to start by making the outside diameter of it. This time I got smart and made myself a little Excel spreadsheet to help me with my math. So that I'm not stumbling over that quite so much. I will, I'm still testing to see if I've got all my formulas what I want them to be, but I'll make that available eventually on the Facebook group. So to jump right in, I'm going to blacken my metal. I've got a good clean edge on one side of my 22 gauge. And I am going to determine the height that I would like my stone to be sitting in. When I'm making one of these step bezels, I really like a tall-ish bezel. The reason I'd want to make it step is to give it a little more height. So I'm thinking I want it standing up maybe a centimeter or so. I'm going to go with slightly heavier. I'm going to go with a 10, knowing that part of the stone will set down into part of it. So it's not going to be a full millimeter. Full centimeter, sorry. There. Line. And if I were going any heavier gauge than this 22, I would not be using the shears, but because it's 22 gauge, oops, if I can make my mark clearly enough. I'm going to just cut this and then hammer flatten it down. If you're using shears like I am, remember that they don't cut chompy like scissors. You want to rest the material on the lower segment of the scissors, of the shears, and push towards them, never using that last 1/4 inch or so, because that'll start to curve off on you. And I don't need this much material, but I'm cutting a nice thick piece that I can use for other things because I've got 2 of these round stones, so I may do a matching set at some point. Okay, so I'm going to flatten this down either with a mallet, or I like my Bonnie Doon, is it, that makes these? Can't remember who makes these. Yeah, Bonnie Doon, with the material that comes in their hydraulic press kit. They make these screw in and screw out handles, and I like how well it flattens. Just straighten it out a bit. And then I'm gonna determine the length that I need using John's formula. So what I did was I put in a couple different formulas in my spreadsheet, because I can make things happen with spreadsheets that I can't make on the fly. I got a 14.4 millimeter diameter, and that means that roughly I'm going to need Accounting for a 22 gauge wall, I'm going to need somewhere between 46 and 50 millimeters length of material. So I'm going to err on the side of caution. So the formula that John gives us is that diameter times 3.5, which is a generous extra portion. But you could also do it times 3.14 and then add in the thickness of your metal. I'm going to go somewhere in the middle between the two of them and go 46 inches. I mean, 46 millimeters, give or take. 47. Let's go with 47 right there. And just marking it and trimming it. It's going to still have some overage. But I'm going to round it against whatever mandrel I have that's similar in shape to what I'm ending up in. In this case, I'm going round, so that makes it a little easier. I have lots of mandrels that are round. Grab some half round pliers, which are my most used pliers on the shelf, I would say. Just round it up. And then I'm going to size it according to the actual stone's needs, which tells me that I need to trim a fair amount away from this. Some excess. I would probably be more exacting if I were working in gold, so I don't have as much scrap. But I also probably wouldn't be making quite such a consequentially sized bezel for such an inexpensive stone. It's just my take on when I'm going to spend my money on gold materials. Again, John points out that it's easier to size up than size down. So I'm going to make this a smidge on the small side and clean it up a little bit just to get a good clean fit. Some of the ways that you can size up include his method that he shows with the pliers, squeezing the walls once you've got it formed. It's actually a pretty clean cut, but I want to just touch it up for shear marks a little bit. So I'm using the barrette file to get my cleanup on these, because then I don't have to worry that I'm over filing the other side at the same time as I file the side I actually care about. Slow and steady wins the race on this one. Getting a nice clean fit. I'm going to pop on over to, is that a good focus spot, or do I need to back it out a little bit? No, it looks pretty good. All right. And I'm using hard solder. John writes in the early chapters that he uses hard solder for as much as possible, leaving easy solder for attaching his bezels to things. He pretty much skips over medium for the most part on bezel making. But that isn't always possible if you're not as skilled as he is at delicate, precise soldering and resoldering exercises. It gets really, really crazy once you start getting into the prong settings where you can be soldering, you know, a dozen solder points in a tiny little location. So I'm just giving myself some variety in my hard solder. In this case, I'm using a wire solder, but you can use chip solder, or you can even use paste solder if you want. I don't have the control when I'm using paste solder for this kind of small scale soldering. And I am using a combination of Prips flux and paste flux. I like paste flux for its stickiness, for its actual paste factor. So I'm just popping that on the line. And as a reminder, heating from the back of the bezel is going to get the seam to help solidify it's getting closed instead of opening it. If I started at the front, it might expand from the heat and open back up. So I'm heating it up a bit using a fairly hot flame. Soldering my seam. Quenching this guy. Heading back over to the other bench. Find my bench towel to dry this baby off so I don't put it on my steel tools while it's wet. And then it back onto the mandrel. The round ones are nice and easy, relatively speaking. See that still? When I'm rounding things, I got to remember that if I have a taper, I need to flip it and round it from both sides. Not hammer all the little tools on my bench off to the bounce of the metal. So I've got a relatively circular form, but it may be a little too small. It's ever so slightly small. So there's a few things I could do. If it's big enough, I can cheat and put it on my ring sizer and just stretch it up. I find I tend to overstretch when I do that. I can also try to stretch it on the mandrel, which when it's this tiny amount is what my go-to usually is. For this, I'm switching over to a little bit more malleable, more reactive mallet rather. I can feel the action a little better than I can when it's hitting the dead blow of the rubber. And I'm just hitting downward. My preferred mallet for this is actually a really good wooden mallet. They're a little hard to come by in good hardwoods these days. I know there's a couple companies still making them, but I haven't found one that I don't tear up. So again, just trying to stretch it down the steel a little bit. If you have a really big sizing, you could be hitting it with a steel hammer, but that's going to really ding up and scratch and change the shape of your metal. See how we're doing. Oh, still needs a little more sizing.
So I have a question.
Sure.
I'm still stuck on page 37 with the actual formula.
His
You said-
3.5 business?
Yeah, because you said 14.4 millimeters multiplied by 3.5 equals 50.4.
Yeah.
And then what?
So that's the outer diameter, that's the length of the strip of material that he's telling you to estimate. And all of John's measurements are estimates. He's just giving you this will be enough material for wrapping it around and having room for the amount of metal you're using.
So the 50.4 is millimeters?
He's probably working in millimeters. Yeah, most stone work is done in millimeters, but that 50 is not a number. That's his example of the diameter of the stone. So what you're doing is multiplying the diameter of your stone, whatever you've measured, by that 3.5 in his case. It's the same as when we were in geometry class as kids and they said multiply by pi, ballpark is 3.14. He's giving, instead of 3.14, he's doing 3.5 to give you a little bit of extra for your filing and your trimming and for the thickness of your metal. I think he's giving a lot more than he needs to personally. That's why I'm trying two formulas and sort of splitting the difference. Because I end up with more wastage than I need to.
Okay, but you said also the gauge of the metal.
So yeah, so instead, many people are measuring their diameter times 3.14 plus the thickness of the metal because you have to account for it in the curve. I'm waving my hands at you as if I was on screen. So there's when you're measuring a diameter of something, you're getting exactly the outer parameter of it. It doesn't account for the fact that the circle is going to actually be a little bigger because it's going around the outside with the thickness of the metal that's wrapping around it, right? So what John has done is, instead of worrying about it, he goes, you know, I'm never going to make something that's more than X amount of thickness of metal thicker. So 3.5 gives me enough room for anything from 26 gauge all the way up through, probably, I'm betting he could get, you know, 16 or even 14 gauge walls if he wanted to, with that estimate that he's doing. People who are being more precise about it are more likely to use the multiply it by 3.14 plus adding your actual thickness. So they're getting them close. So Jenna's saying she's making 18 gauge bezels and she's using a lot more like 3.2 instead of 3.14, which I completely understand. You're getting much closer and not having so much excess material when you do that. Did that cover it? That make sense?
Okay, so I can just stick to the formula and not have to worry about the actual gauge.
Right. John's version is sort of agnostic to the gauge. It just leaves you more excess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where I was like, I really tried. But
and that's what it was. I was trying last time when I was trying to use his logic for it, because it just doesn't quite click when you've also learned that 3.14 model. And ovals gets a little fancier. So yeah, it all adds up in the end. And again, you don't have to use measurements if you're better at just wrapping your metal around in the first place, or if you want to take a string or a piece of tape to get your measurements. All we're trying to get you is close to your total measurement, but not short of it, so that you don't have to do too much sizing. And you're not soldering it until you've measured it to the precision that you want, no matter what you do.
Okay. I was just trying to at least get an idea, but thank you.
Yeah. Okay, this is not sizing as quickly as I would like. What do I need? I may have to go over to my handy dandy ring sizer. Oh, so close. I'm going to pop over to my ring sizer for 30 seconds. Just squeeze this a little bit bigger. Almost. It's close enough to fit in there, but a little too snug for my tastes for actually setting. So I've now got to do ever so slightly bigger than that. There we go. Oh, still a little snug. Let's see. So that's a good fit, but it may be a little hard if anything goes awry in my subsequent soldering. So I think I need one tiny squeeze more. A ring sizer is one of those tools that's ridiculously expensive, but once you learn to have one, you know, like once you've grown accustomed to having one, it can really spoil you. All right, so I'm happy with that fit, which is nice and snug. And now I'm going to work on sanding this down using the board that I created based on John's recommendation that we put it on plexiglass. So for those of you that weren't here before, all this is I've done a 320, a 400, a 600, and 1,000 grit. Most of what I'm doing, as you can tell from the splotches, is working on the rougher end to take material down. You could also do this by hand filing. You could do this by a grinder if you've got a grinder, or a belt sander. It's a little coarse, so it takes things away quickly. But for this small an amount, I'm just going to clean up the bottom. And he likes the water-based, wet dry sandpaper. It's a little more durable. But it tends to wear fairly quickly, so I may at some point swap out my 320. I have a penchant for sort of going what I call squiggly lines sort of all over the place when I'm doing this kind of sanding, because our pressure, when we push down on something to sand, we tend to put force going forward. So I like to move the ring around as I'm working on it to try and even things out. Ooh, we have people from Mexico. How exciting. Feel free to post where you're from, folks. All right, and if you have trouble determining if your sanding and filing is making things even, don't forget that you can always just put a Sharpie mark around the bezel or around whatever you're sanding and filing. And when you sand, you want to make sure that it goes away consistently. So if I've still got a little bit showing of the Sharpie, it means I didn't do a fully consistent job all the way around. So that side's looking pretty good. I'm betting this side is not even close. And if you are not terribly consistent in your cutting, in that you may have, wobbled a little bit as you were cutting your strip, you're going to want to check that your dimensions all the way around are staying even, because again, we might sand it uneven, or we might have cut it in the first place uneven. So all I'm going to do is take a check at a few different spots to see if I have anything that's much narrower. We're doing okay on that. Oh, there we're going up. Yikes. So I've got one side that goes up to 10.15. And I go as small as 9.8. Oh, let me see if I'm measuring this well. No, I'm just not staying even. 9.9, 9.7, 9.9. There we go. I'm just going to straighten it out. 9.8. 9.6. So this is not as even as I would like. So what I'm going to do to fix that is Sharpie all the way around, find my lowest point, and score it along the top edge. And we're talking like 0.1 millimeter at this point. So it's not a huge difference. It may not even be visible to the eye, but since I'm trying to get more precise as part of my practice, I'm going to take the time to do those kinds of steps to get things in good shape. So looking at my low point, where's my low point? Eight, 6, so that's where we are. So I'm starting at my low point, and I'm just going to see if I can do this while it's up in the air so you guys can see me doing it. I'm just looking to score the very top edge wherever I have excess. So one side of this has a little bit of height that the other side doesn't. Not sure that's going to show to you guys. There's a tiny, tiny line along the top. And so I'm going to take that off with a fairly good sized file, because with a file I can control the area that I'm hitting more than if I'm using a flat surface where I can't really watch it as it comes off. A lot of times for me, this lump happens to one side of the seam. If I didn't stay clean in my initial cut, or if I haven't been paying attention to keeping my sanding consistent. See any of my remainder marks. Yep, that makes me a lot happier. So it's not a hell of a lot, but it's just enough to sort of even things out. And if somebody has an attentive eye, they might notice that it's ever so slightly off. Could I fix this later? Potentially, but it's going to be a lot once I put since I'm using the proportions of the walls to figure out where to set my inner wall, having it start out in good shape is important. It'll make positioning the inner ring a little easier. Okay, so we're looking good on both sides. I now have an outer wall. Very exciting. And it's time to make the inner wall. If we were doing the prior method where we did sheet metal, we would just be cutting a strip that is the difference in where we want this to sit. So where we have enough room to actually set the stone, which is far less than you think when you first look at these stones. So I don't need much. If I were building an inner wall, I would build it to about that height. So about 2/3 of this design up the wall. It's not always going to be 2/3. It depends on how much extra height you're building into your piece, but maybe you can see it. Basically, I want the stone to be using that 1/3 to 1/4 measurement, 1/4 to 1/3 range to get it up over the beginning of the curve. Your wall doesn't need to end up really wrapped around the stone. It just needs to hit the bend. So John describes that as being 1/3 to 1/4, and he doesn't go down to 1/4 unless you're working with a heavier gauge bezel. So going down to 1/4 means there's less to compress, but it's also a thicker wall to hold it more snugly in place. It's less likely to flex out of place. Okay, so with that in mind, this version, what we're doing instead of making a whole wall is we're going to make a ring that fits snugly inside, and then we're going to position it at the point that we want the stone to rest. So basically at the top of what would have been the sheet wall is where we're putting the square wire, okay, or round wire. You can use either. I'm going to use square wire. And this is same basic principle, except that instead of making it big enough to go around, I'm making it big enough to go inside of this. So there you can do the math route, or you can do the ballpark route. For this, I'm going to do the ballpark route by putting this on my mandrel, determining where I would be if I were just below it, and making a ring, then trimming it back down. Whoops, I'm not in screen. So I'm just putting this, that's my max that it would be. This is going to be too big, but it gives me enough material to hold on to and cut. John doesn't go into a lot of specifics about how he does this in the book. It is possible to just use the formulas that we've been using. But it's like, I've had, even if you buy it as 18 gauge wire, I've had wire that comes in at 17 gauge instead, or 17.5. And I've had sheet that comes in a half size off. You do want to make sure that your wire, if you're using square, is flush up or down. You don't want, right now it's torqued on me a little bit, so I need to flatten this because we're making a level lip for it to land on, basically. And then I'm working it into a smaller circle that is going to just barely fit inside my outer ring. And that can be by overlapping them a bit to spiral them. So I'm just doing that, making like key ring style overlap. I want to keep it fairly close to the shape so that I can get close to my sizing, because just like with the problem that I had on doing the oval last time, if this is too loose, when you go to attach it, it can open up at the seam. So this needs to be difficult to get inside the outer ring, which can mean sizing it a little smaller than you expect, and then squeeze sizing it or stretching it. So I'm still too big for this ring. Snip a little more away. And I'm now starting to get in the realm, but it's still a little big. Err on the side of too small, because you can stretch it up, but you can't squeeze it down. And I know that I find myself all the time thinking I've got the sizing right, realizing it's too big after I've rounded it back out, and having to cut it and re-solder it. There's no shame in that. You just really want to get your tightest fit.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Oh, okay, so you're doing the outer wall. It hasn't been soldered. And then
Outer
you're
wall
doing-
has.
Oh, it has been soldered.
Yep. That was what I was soldering a moment ago before I started rounding it.
Okay, I must have skipped that. I'm
That's
sorry.
okay.
Because I saw you putting it in there and I was thinking, how can she put the inner in there if it hasn't been soldered?
Yep.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so my outer is soldered and re-rounded. And now my inner that I've got is a little too small to stay on its own accord in there. So I'm going to solder it at that size, and then I'm going to stretch it until it's hard to put into this.
Okay.
Okay, because we want to make it, it needs to be difficult to place inside of the outer ring, or else it'll slide out, it'll reposition.
When I did mine, it wasn't big enough.
Mhm.
It was kind of lopsided. I soldered it anyway and it worked, but it was bad.
Was it level when you were done with it?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's about, you know, my students will often ask me to tell them whether something is good enough. And the answer is always going to be, is it good enough for you? And that sounds kind of weird, but you're the one that's going to be wearing it, or if you're trying to sell it, you're the one that has to be okay with the quality you're selling. And so if it's not good enough for you, you redo it. If it is good enough for you, or if it's good enough for a learning experience and you're going to do your next one better, that's totally acceptable.
Yeah, I was thinking about doing the circle next.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I mean, it was good enough because I didn't do it before. So at least I got something done.
Right,
you know, for me.
exactly.
So
And that's,
yeah, it's a
journal your
sample for me.
ideas, journal your discoveries on each step of this so that you know what you want to do differently the next time. It's exactly why I went back and made another one of those ovals, is that was not up to my personal standards for what I want when I'm completing a project, especially when I'm trying to, as one of my goals that I set for this project, I'm trying to be more meticulous and slow down what I'm doing so that I'm doing it right the first time for me. I find that I go through phases of, oh my gosh, I have to do everything fast all the time. Oops, I didn't switch cameras for you guys. I find that I'll sometimes go through phases where I want to rush all the things. And then I realize, wait a minute, I'm not doing quality work. I need to slow it back down. Especially if I'm doing production work, I find I go too fast because I just want to get it out of the way to go do the fun, new, one-of-a-kind things that I enjoy doing more. So I'm rounding this one again, or just like I did on the outer ring. I'm going to check it. And if it falls through like this one does, it is not big enough. It isn't good enough for it to just look like it fits. It needs to actually be hard to get in there. So this needs, I'm going to actually go back over to the ring stretcher. I'm going to stretch it again. This one. no, I'm not, because it's too small for my ring stretcher. So I can either continue to hammer it down the mandrel, or I can use John's technique of using the pliers to stretch it. If I do that on something this delicate, I'm going to be able to see all of the little bumps that I've made, because I'll be seeing this from the inside and the outside. So in this case, I'm going to actually just properly continue to stretch it. Even on something as thin as this little band, I'm still flipping front to back because of the taper of the mandrel. Doing. Still too small, goes in too easily. And if there's a huge gap, I'm going to go back and make another one, because this is going to take forever, but this one's getting close. If it's taking a while, I may need to anneal it, because I may be work hardening it too much to really make the sizing up work well. Okay, so we're starting to get to the size where it wants to hang out without sliding all the way through. So we're getting super close, but it's still not tight enough that I have to force it in there. So I'm going to keep going. Kristen, you put a whole bunch of stuff about the excess, so I'm going to read it in a sec, but it's a wall of text while I'm working.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted to demonstrate 3 millimeter difference in the excess versus the I guess traditional calculation.
Yep.
So there's a lot of excess, and Jen had mentioned that she was using 3.2 versus pi, because she
Yep.
was using 18 karat gold bezels, so she didn't want to waste.
Right.
So
I'm going to do a quick annealing on this. Yeah, I have a sneaking suspicion that John may have meant to put in 3.15 in the book. That
I
he's
agree.
more precise than that. There's a couple spots like that I question what the intent was. So, oops, wrong mallet. On this technique, if you're using the round wire, you don't have to do any filing down. If you're using square wire, if it's really, really square, you're going to want to blunt the wall of the edge that's going to be facing the outer wall of the inner ring, the one that's going to be getting solder coming into it. Getting so close. Is this actually getting tight enough? It is getting tight enough. So what I mean by that is draw. As a reminder, when we did the wall diversion, outer wall and the inner wall, he had us file down an angle. Oops, I'm on the wrong screen again. He had us file down the angle in here so that there's room for the solder to fill, right? Same thing holds true if we're doing a square wire frame. We want to notch that off the outer edge so that there's a little room for the solder to fill, so that it leaves a flat level seat instead of doing this when the solder flows. Is that making sense to folks? If you're using a round wire, it's not going to matter because you're going to automatically have a gap for the solder to flow into right there.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So on a square wire, once we have a good fit, which this still may need a little smidge more than I've got. Can't quite tell. Yeah, I need a tiny bit more to keep this tight because it's too easy to get in there. Then I'm going to take the outer corner off. I'm also going to make sure I flatten it because I may have distorted its form as I was sizing. Let's see how that fits now. Still be comfortable. Oh, there it is. Getting a little snug. Okay, so we take a little bit of an edge off of the outer rim, and it really is just the tiniest bit all the way around. You could, if you wanted to, take it off of the bottom as well so that the solder is flowing in cleanly, but it's going to be so nominally visible. This is really just about keeping a flat surface on the top. Okay, so I've got my top and I've got my inner and outer rings now. And I need to get it snug in there so that it stays of its own accord at the height that I want my stone to set. So one of the easiest ways to do this, if the stone will put up with it, is to actually put your stone in place and then gently push with something to even it out. And make sure you're level and not too low down, because it's easy to push it further than you think once you start. I'm just balancing this out a little bit, trying to make sure I'm at the same height on all things. Squared up, as it were. So I can see already that I'm tilting on one side. If you look there, I've got it sloping down. I need to get it pushed up the other side. And this is where this may take a number of minutes to get just right, because it needs to be that snug that you're really having a hard time pushing it back and forth. If you have real trouble getting these positioned, you can do what are called stitches, where you raise a tiny little bead of metal just below the point that you want it to stay all the way around, you know, like 2 or 3 of them, so that you've got it positioned where you want it and it won't slide lower than that. I think John talks about stitches in chapter 5, I want to say, when he starts talking about graver settings. Maybe that's later in the book. Okay, this is snug enough that it's giving me some grief. And if this is too loose when you go to solder it, it's going to just slide down because the heat and the flow and everything is going to shift the metal. Oop, I got too far away. So we're at a fairly good height. Before I solder, I'm going to check that I'm actually level all around. So what I'm doing to get that is I'm using the calipers and spot checking sort of 4 quadrants to see if I'm at the same height. Not entirely. One side is a little bit higher than the other. Just have to make sure you're at the same angle, or you could actually use, now that I think about it, if you have one of the fancier versions of these, they have a depth measuring gauge. Help actually. Still not quite even. get myself a similarly sized punch so that I can use an even pressure down. Try to tap it slowly in at a steady, consistent level. So close. Still. Okay. All right, I'm hopping back over to the soldering block. Per John's recommendation, we're going to try and use hard solder. And if this is not snug enough, it's likely to slide down. If it comes to
Rachel, this is Jen. Quick question.
Sure. Yeah.
I was a little late on the call today, so apologies if you already said this, but what size torch tip are you using?
I'm using an acetylene air torch, Smith torch with a #1 tip, which is
Okay.
my go-to for about 90% of the work that I do.
Cool, thanks.
Oh, somebody, yeah, Kristen, you said the doming set. That was exactly what I went to when I was realizing that I had a device nearby that I could use. Thank you for that. So that was Kristen's recommendation is what you just saw me trying to do. Oops, I always forget my goggles when I'm on screen. Get my goggles and a little bit of my paste flux. Up. Just going to use a couple pieces of hard solder. John actually recommends going from the back side so that you're not putting blobs of solder in your snugly fitted bezel. It's going to be an interesting one because I've done such a high wall. It's pretty good. Discover if we had shift or not. Okay, so we've got it soldered in place. At this point, it'll get pickled and all of that good stuff, but I'm just going to check the fit to see how we're doing. Okay, good snug fit, nice resting. Bezel, ta-da. So again, gives you less weight on the piece. You can do more interesting things in terms of height and so on. John does a lot of play with cutting away materials. This is also the basis of later in the book, there's a double-ended setting that he does. So you can use the same center wire for setting 2 stones back to back. So that's a good practice to learn there. I'm going to put this in the pickle. Any questions on that one before we move on to harder shapes? Okay, silence is golden. I'm gonna pop this in the pickle. Give me a sec. And will not make you watch me do all the sanding and filing on it. So next up is shoulder bezels for square and rectangular shapes with points. And he has given us 2 different approaches, the same basic concepts that we've just done, using a double wall. So you build your outer wall, then you build your inner wall, which is the way that I personally find easiest. But then he also has what he calls method 2. So if you're playing along at home, in the book, we are at roughly, where's my page on this one? We are looking at page 67. Actually talking to you guys. So page 67, and there's some stuff that I want to point out to you that has contradictory language. Oh, I am not at the right screen. There we go. So there's contradictory language on page 67 that I want to clarify for you because it caught me up and I wasn't getting what I needed to out of it. Middle of the method 2 section, or towards the bottom, the last paragraph starts with, from here, the assembly is the same as described above, which implies that once you've got your bezel walls built, if you're using method 2, which is to create a strip with another strip soldered down to it before you do any cutting and filing, it implies that after that, you're going to do all the same steps that you've done for shaping things in the first method. And that is not the case. Over on the drawing to the right of it is the little, I told you guys in one of the earlier sessions, a lot of the important notes are in the descriptions of the drawings. So as before, cut a 90-degree notch with a square needle file, bend the corners, and then important below with the third picture down is file a 45-degree angle on each. So in method 1, he's teaching us to create the box in pieces where they sort of lock together into each other. But in method 2, you have to get more precise because you're sizing it to get a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to draw why that's an issue, because this one caught me when I was like, there's something missing in this, John. What is the step that I'm missing? So let me go back to my handy dandy whiteboard. And we're going to do method 1 first so that you can see what I consider to be the easier of the 2 ways to do a square or a rectangle bezel, either faceted or cab, it doesn't matter. But then method 2 is super handy, and I'm thinking I'm going to do one as an oval, which it's super easy for, and then try the square shape, because that's where you have to get much more precise with your filing and measuring. So if we do method 1, what we're doing is we're building a wall that goes beyond the set of the stone. So let's say this is my stone here, right? So we've built wall 1, the outer wall, and he has us making it run long so that when we build wall 2, we do that in a different color. And by wall 2, I mean the second of the outer wall segments, not the inner wall yet. So, and this one actually he has coming across too. So this comes beyond the stone for now in version 1. Because what we're doing is we're cutting only the short wall to fit, and the others go past each other, right? Do this right. So one wall and the other wall. And he's having us trim these, but not the long walls in version 1. We only trim those after we've positioned them and soldered them at these points. In version 2, if you try to do that, you're going to have a wall that once you, because you've already put in your second wall, that once you try to get these butting up, I'm not even sure I can draw this. It's so dimensional that you need to be aware of it. When we put the other wall up against it, we're going to have a gap where this space is, because we'll have, instead of, if we don't have the 45-degree angle, we don't have any way to run past it without leaving a gap. So this right here would create gaps if we use the run past model with pre-made step bezel. The only way to get the pre-made step bezel to work correctly is to have a clean, actually sized 45-degree corner where they meet up. That will make a whole lot more sense to you if you try making some of that step wire, which I'm going to do, but I'm first going to do the easier one. I hope that didn't confuse more than it helps. I'm just seeing if there's anything I need to weigh in on here. Let's see. We've got measurements from Kristen. Alan's got his formulas. Yep. D plus T. Oh yeah. So what are your dimensions? What are your letters there, Alan? Thickness of the metal is T.
Yeah. Yeah, D is, can you hear me?
Yep.
D is the diameter of the stone.
Yep.
T is the thickness of the metal.
Got it.
And you, of course, add those together first.
And then do your 3.14.
Now, that'll be exactly the right size, but you probably want to make it 2/10 smaller so you can stretch it up.
For the inner rings, probably, yeah. For the outer rings, you may want to make it bigger so you have room to file a clean.
What you
Clean
do
line.
actually is you take the diameter minus the thickness, multiply it by 3.14, and that should be perfect for the inside.
Oh, duh. That makes a lot of sense. Of course. Math, it's a thing. Okay, so for this wall that I'm going to make the square wall, a rectangular wall, rather, I am, in this case, using a cab. But again, you could do cab or faceted. The shoulder bezels work well for both. Show off this stone that I'm using. And I'm making my outer wall out of 22 gauge again, just because it's a nice, easy thickness. Some 22 that are blackened. Yes, I did. Do it for time. And again, I can decide my height for the design. Let me see. Another one in this style that I want to get a height from. Okay, so I'm going to make this 7 meters. It's a little bit more than that, 7.5 for some filing. Much stuff on my bench. Right camera. Okay. So once again, flattening this down. You would be doing the same exact step if you're making the version 2, in that you're making a skirting strip. You just want to be super, super exacting. There's not as much leeway to sand and file after the fact on version 2. So another reason that I like this particular approach. And then my math on this one, I'm doing my width and my length. Check these. I can put them in already. 14.79. Okay, I'm going to about 50 millimeters of this. Except that I'm only doing 2 sides, so I've got to follow John's directions. I do not actually need to trim a length on this the way that I do on a round, because my first task is that I'm going to mark out the width of the short end, which is 10.2 in this case. And then on my piece of metal, I'm going to give myself a couple extra millimeters beyond what I measured for trim. And for our filing of the corner, and that's the important part. John's got a really nice write-up for us on the compression factor. What's it called? Not the compression factor. About how the bend is going to take up a lot of our length of the material. So I'm going longer than the width of my narrowest end. Look, it's marked. In order to give myself a little leeway for my corner filing. So I don't know if you guys can see that, but I've given myself a smidge extra, millimeter or 2 extra. My mark is right here, so that I can now do the corner creation of this. This is assuming that I'm working with a good, clean starting edge, which I realize I'm not. So I need to square this up a little bit. Always good if you can use the factory cut edge or a shear cut edge that's fairly straight. But since I've been cutting several pieces from this, I need to be a little bit more specific. Okay, and then we are cutting the first corner, or excuse me, we are notching the first corner. John doesn't talk about it in here, but when we do boxes with him, he starts us out by doing a saw mark starting point on it, on any angle that you're cornering to get a nice crisp corner. So if I can find my for life. So all I'm doing is on my straight line, after getting my square and scoring this a little more deeply. My square, I've been looking for it for a while. Goodness. Super messy bench. There it is. So I'm just using a square to then do as deep a score as I can. It's really hard to keep in screen for you guys and use my usual force. There we go. So I've got a score mark. Now I've got 3 score marks because I'm doing it at a distance. And then I'm just going to run a saw line down my squared edge, and I don't want to cut through. I just want to make a track enough that I can file in it with a triangle file. So triangle file into the groove. And this is a slow and steady file. You want to stay as straight as possible. And just like with the sanding, you periodically want to flip it because our penchant is to file downward, and we want an even depth all the way across. Go slow. And we're aiming for about 2/3 of the way through. So another tidbit from the box class with John is that he does not talk about in the book. He only uses the triangle file in the book, is that you, in order to get a good corner, you do triangle file for your main creation of the depth of the gouge, which I may need to go a little further. And then you do a final pass with the square, because the width of what you're gouging is actually a little wider than the shape of the file. So if you were to do your whole angle cut with the square, it would actually be wider than 90 degrees. So you just do a touch up at the very end of a couple strokes with the square file from each direction. Then the other thing that he taught me that sort of blew my mind is that I've been using parallel jaw pliers wrong. I was doing the bendy thing with my pliers, but you don't. You bend against the plier. So you set your plier up against the line, that just to the outside of the line that you've got gouged in, and you push against it. So you're using this as the stabilizer, not as the tool of bending. It's not always possible if it's too heavy, but what that does is get you a much crisper corner than you would get, because you're ending up, if you're twisting, you're torquing the metal, so you're going to end up wobbling it more. So I really like that feature of, don't forget, and you've also got a flat surface there if you're using a standard pair. This would not work if, for example, I were using my pointed pair where I've got more angle in there, but up against a flat set of parallel jaw pliers, boom, that's a really nice slick bend. Okay, and you can also squeeze from the other side and just make sure that you're tight and upright in all of your angles. It starts you out a lot closer from the beginning. There's my little stone. So I now built in one corner, one short end, with a little bit of overhang. And I do mean a little bit. I barely gave myself any, right? And I'm going to trim off with extra length on the long end. Just leave myself enough, and it doesn't even have to be a super clean cut. So there's wall one that I've started building. And then I'm going to do that same exercise again for the other end. It's a good thing to check if your ends are actually the same size as one another. I have a sneaking suspicion. Yeah, one of my ends is a little wider than the other, so I'm going to make this one a little bit wider than I did on the other time. So once again, I'm measuring the width of the wall I'm going against, and then I'm giving myself about 2 millimeters more in width so that I have some overage to trim away in a minute. I need to make sure that my end is squared off. If you want to be very, very precise, you could put it in a vise and file it square. In my case, I'm going to use my square and square it, score it and trim it. Because again, I'm leaving myself enough to trim off later, so I'm not worried about it for the sake of the edge. I'm worried about it for the sake of, am I making a square line when I'm scoring? Again, I'm lining it up with my square. Square, scoring it. Taking the saw to get a start to it. Notice that this is not a normal jewelry angle for sawing. You have to kind of be at a weird surface level to it, either flat like this or lift it up a little bit, because you do not want to be cutting through this. You're just using it as a starting marker point to hold your square line for the subsequent triangle file. So just enough to get a groove in there. And then triangle file time. I always have to remind myself to slow down on these, because I want to go fast and then I get off track and it gets to be not a square line. Go from both sides so that I'm not being inconsistent in the track. Checking for about 2/3 of the way through, not quite, go a little further. And then I'm going to touch it up with a couple passes of the square file at the very end. As you do that, you'll feel the difference in the cut because the triangle file sort of has room to breathe, I guess I'd say. And you'll feel that that tiny final pass with the square file really is grabbing the metal on both sides. So you can see how much it digs out the difference between a triangle and a square on there. I'm lining up against the line and pushing to get my cornering as neat as I can get it. Yeah, that's one of my favorite, like, just there's tons of tiny extra tidbits that come out as John is teaching. Oh, somebody pasting something not meant for us on the chat. Where's that to me? Oh, sorry, that's my mother trying to send me messages. Sorry. This is the second side of my walls, and I now am going to start sizing them down. Let me get those in and ballparked. So I'm making my little house with the extra walls. But I, again, have overage of metal, so I'm going to trim back a little bit on the long side. And make sure that I have enough and then some to go around, okay? I'm now going to check that I'm as straight and as square as I can get, because the next step is to touch up those corners with a smidge bit of hard solder to make sure that they stay cornered. So I want everything as straight and true as I can make it, knowing that I'll still have a chance to square it up really a couple times from now, but I don't want it way distorted in one direction or the other. Okay. So there we go. So this is just a matter of a dab in each corner, getting it to flow down the line. You don't want to overdo it because you don't, your corners especially, you don't want flushed, filled up with tons of solder, because it's harder to bend even then, and corners are already troublesome. And do this at an angle that you guys can see while I can still see. Yep, just putting it down the wall. Just enough to fill what we've filed out back to a stable corner, so it's not gonna bend on us. Okay. The pictures on page 65, the angles filed to what they would be 90 degrees with the result of a square file. So yes, when you're asking, Donna, you're asking about the corners in here?
Yeah, the groove. Maybe I misunderstood. It sounded like it would start with a triangle file, but then go to a square, but just a little bit. But you
Yes.
really get a 90-degree carved out of there, correct?
That's exactly it. But I think in the book, John only uses a triangle file. Did I miss that he touches it up in there with the square?
Yeah, maybe not. That's what was confusing me too. And I think what you said, now I understand it. You
Yeah.
really are for the square, but start with the triangle.
Yep, yeah, so that was what I was saying, is that he had taught us when I took his box making class, he showed us that addendum that when you start with the triangle file, touch up with the square instead of doing all square or all triangle, you're gonna get a closer to perfect 90-degree file.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure, yep, oops, I'm still on the wrong camera. There we go. So I now have these outer walls, a little bit wobbly for wear, so I'm gonna straighten them out a bit. And at this point, I probably want to check that they're relatively square for my next fitting. So I've got a good square in there. And a pretty good square in there, no wobblies. And then I'm going to choose one. One of these I made longer than the other because the wall was longer. I'm going to choose one, and this is where the marking starts to get into the precision factor. You are marking your cut position just at the end of the stone. So we're now trimming down the short wall to be just the length of going to the outside edge of the stone. Draw that one. Does he have good drawings on that one? I think he does. So we currently have a wall, an outer wall only, that does this, and a stone that fits here with a little overage and a lot of overage. We're now going to mark the outer edge of the stone so that if we ran a line from the wall along the side wall, which will become our next wall, we just butt up against it, because then our short wall is going to be flush to the end of the stone and meet up with our subsequent build of the long second wall, right? So this is what we're trimming back to, is that point. And we're going to do it for the other side as well. Measurement, and I'm going to trim it with enough room to file it square if I don't do a clean enough cut, because I want a nice neat wall. Giving myself a smidge to square up. Filing in screen, in frame, while supported is a fun thing. Excess cut off. Okay, so I still have a smidge to take off of that. Smidge is a nice technical term. Less than a scotch. All right, so I've now got my first short wall only sized. And now I'm going to do the opposite wall, on the opposite short wall. Make sure I'm squared up as I need to be for this stone, which is not perfectly square. So I'm going to open it out a tiny bit. And marking it just at the outside edge. Just a tiny amount taken off. Square though. Okay, so now that I've got them both trimmed, my walls should be able to squish together so that they actually fit the stone enough that I can pick it up in there if I'm holding it snugly. Oop, almost holding it snugly. Hang on a sec. Jeweler's crouch. Forget which side is the long side. Oop, so I need to trim a tiny bit more off of this. I think, yeah, I need to trim one side or the other. It needs a little bit taken off of it. Still a little too big on one. There we go. Nice fit that just by getting a snug wrap around, I now know it's the right outside size because it can be held snugly just by lifting it up, clasped between those pieces. So next up is marking the outside where the walls meet. So I need to score this so that I have a good clear mark that I can follow because I'm going to trim it away. I can figure out where the heck I put my place. It's right in front of me. Silly. All right, so I'm going to just score a line along the outside perimeter where the short wall meets the long wall. I'm going to follow that up with a Sharpie line as well. Because I'm now going to position it at those points on my soldering block and solder these last two corners in place. Now, if you have a hard time positioning things, first of all, make sure you have a flat surface on your block. That's going to make a big difference. If you have a hard time keeping things snugly fitted together, great addition, cheap addition to your bench is T-pins, which are just, make sure you get the steel ones and don't put them in your pickle. They just give you a little extra push to hold things together once you've got them lined up, if you angle them correctly. So I'm just doing enough to help keep them compacted together so they don't want to shift. You could also use, if you have binding wire, you could make a little like croquet hoop out of binding wire and use that pushed into your block. Again, I'm using hard solder for this. More solder than I probably needed, but I'm good with that. This side's good. This side not flow all the way. Smidge more solder down that one. Okay. We have an outer frame. It's a little funky looking. Back to our bench. Questions so far on this layer? Okay. So I'm just going to rough trim the excess. Well, I suppose I should be smart and check that it still fits my stone. It does. We're good. But then I'm going to rough trim the excess long sides away and leave it. As we remember from John's earlier lesson in the book, he doesn't do the filing until he has to. So you don't want to trim out those edges until there's no other option than to do it, because you're going to block your own work. So we've got our outer wall, and this is still method one. We're going to now build the inner wall the same way, but shorter, which means I need to clean this up to do a little bit of sanding to make sure that my height is consistent where I want it. So some quick sand action. And changing directions. One little corner that doesn't want to come clean. Okay. I'm enjoying this whole having a sanding board that has all the sanding options on one, instead of going scrabbling for scraps. I'm just going to square up my walls after that because I was pinching in a bit. Make sure that I'm still in good shape for the stone. Just a little bit more than I realized on one side. And then confirming that I've got good height all the way around, consistent height rather. Because if I'm making an inner wall, I don't want to have it distorted by the outer wall's height being different. So spot checking. One high spot. No, I'm just measuring at an angle. There we go. So that one's looking pretty good. Now I need to decide how far into the setting I want this, which has to at least allow me to go over the edges of my stone. So I'm going to aim for, that looks like a good height. So it gives me enough room. I'm going to aim for 5 millimeter thickness of my now 24 gauge. Find the 24 gauge. That is not the 24 gauge. That's the 24 gauge. And we're just building a mini version of what we just did. Because it's going to fit snugly inside. Questions? What did I say? I wanted 5 millimeters. .24 gauge is nice and easy to cut with the shears. And this style of bezel looks really nice in a heavy gauge as well. You just do it for the outer layer only. The inner layer still only needs to be the 24. Unless you have a really unusually badly cut stone. And just like with the first pass, we can use the width of the small end. We're going to trim it away either way. So I can just find my width and give myself maybe a millimeter at this point instead of 2, because I know I'm going to trim it anyhow. And again, in this case, smaller is better than too big, because you're going to stretch it to fit snugly and you can't squeeze it down. So I'm scoring, I'm using my square that keeps escaping me. Go. Sawing a starting groove. Got to be extra careful on the thinner metal, not to go through. Triangle file. Slow and steady. Coming from both sides. And finishing it up with the square. Ending it by pushing it against the parallel jaw pliers to get that nice crisp corner. And then trimming it long. And doing the same thing over again for the other side. Scoring it. Nice square line. Using the saw to put in a notch or a starting gouge. Going to the triangle file. Slow and steady, get that line straight. Do it from both sides so that it's even. And finish it off with the square file. Using the parallel jaw, pushing it against it to get it nice and square. Trimming it to similar length for the other one. Hopping over to the soldering station. Putting in my corner support. Oops, I need to cut a little more solder though. If you find you use too much solder, consider either hammering out or rolling in your rolling mill if you have one, your solder into sort of thick sheet, thick wire, flattened wire, and trim the same length you've been trimming, just now that it's flattened. There will be less of it. So that helps you train to use less and less solder each time. Because as John says, how much solder? Enough. Thanks, John. Enough. And just getting enough flowing down the crack that we just made. Stabilize that a little bit. And now comes the fun, tedious part, where we need to size it to the inside. So let's dry these off. So as a reminder, if you have progress that you want to show or questions, you want to say, hey, I'm stuck here or whatever, the last 15 minutes of the session, we do that after I lay out for people who don't want to stay for that part, what I'll be working on in the next session. And again, if you're following along at home, go at your own pace. Don't stress over what other people are or are not doing, and decide what things you want to do more than once and what things you're good with. So in this case, what we're trimming to is a little tricky. It's inside the walls. So we're going to trim shy of the mark that we made before. So before we were marking to the outside, now we're going to mark just on the inside. And it's a guesstimate, because we're going to probably have to do a couple passes to trim away to the right narrowness. If you wanted to do the math on it, it would be whatever your inside diameter is, less the double thickness of the walls, so the outer and outer two walls. So you could do it on paper as well as doing these ballpark measurements. In either case, your goal is as snug a fit as you can make. And this time you can't get away with just doing the outer and inner, because we're gonna do the inside first until we're happy with it, check it, and solder them together, and then we're gonna clean it up from there. So I'm in pretty good shape on that side. There's my score. I'm marking again, just inside of the outer wall of the stone. Stuff out a bit. Get sure that will fit inside. So my test is from above, can I get it in there? One side or the other in this case. I can, but when I put another wall on there, I'm not going to have room for it. So I'm going to trim this a little further back. We're going to be doing some guaranteed stretching of the bezel to get it snug. Okay, and then we would square them up, but what we really need to do is square them up again, just inside the lines, the length of the stone. So we can use the outer one as a bit of a guide. And see where we're going to land. And then mark them. Can I not have Sharpies that are working? Okay. Make sure my walls are squared up using the pliers here. Check that they are squared in their corners nicely. A bit of wiggle.
Miss Rachel.
Yeah.
Are you working with brass or gold?
Neither. I'm working with sterling silver.
Oh, it looks gold on the screen.
It's right now, I haven't put it in the pickle post last soldering. So that's what you're seeing here is the pickle and the blackening from my last soldering.
Okay.
Okay. Just want to see that looks wider on one side than the other. It's definitely wider on one side than I want it to be. Yeah, John pickles as little as possible. It's a little strange how little he pickles, in fact, because there's times when I think, man, nothing is going to stick when you solder those together. But one of the coolest early lessons I got from him was about how to clean your metal with your torch. If you've got, other than if you have an air anything torch, it'll work. But if you have an oxy anything torch, it does not. The outermost stage of the torch, which I'll show when I'm on screen, is the deoxygenating stage of it. Exactly. Set this up for soldering and then we'll go from there. All right, so the 3 stages, is the flame showing? The 3 stages of the flame are the bright blue, then this bluish to orange, and then where it gets orangey and puffy. That last stage has the effect of deoxygenating, meaning it'll take away the stuff that is oxidizing your material. So you can actually keep your metal in that far end and it'll start to clean up. So if you're in the middle of a soldering and you don't, you're heated up and it's just not sticking, it's grubby. You want to get it a little bit cleaner so you can get your solder to flow. Pull your torch back a little ways and use that stretch of it to clean it up. Oops, I lost my bit of solder. Very nice. Right. Okay, we've got our draft of our inner frame. And I say draft because we've got to do a lot of work to fix it up and get it tightly fitted into the inner frame. Now at this point, we are going to want to pickle. I'm just going to trim away some of the excess because we want to be able to have it fit snugly without any, flux leftovers or anything into this box. So we're super close on the size, but I need to toss both of those in the pickle to clean up for 30 seconds. Questions while I do that?
When you're making a shelf bezel for yourself, do you prefer using the wire shelf or the sheet shelf?
I tend to do mine with the sheet shelf more often than not. The wire shelf is definitely lighter. So if you're going bigger, it's super handy to keep your weight down. I have one that I finished a while back that I can show you. This is, let me pull it over to the other location because it has a better camera. So the look, is that focusing at all? The look of the step bezel is kind of cool. So if you've got something where people are going to see the back a lot, it's got kind of a neat effect, but 90% of what I do, I'm making a sheet bezel. It's just that like the heavier, the bigger you get, the better having the weight reduction. If you're doing a big pendant or something with a really heavy malachite or what have you, you can reduce that much metal weight and save on silver, frankly. So keep your costs down. So it's case by case.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to see if that's clean enough to do something with. And then we'll get this frame put together. With me, just brushing off the crud on these. Perfectly cleaned up, but they're enough cleaned up that we can fit them and solder them. So I've got my outer frame out of 22 gauge. I've got my, oops, I'm on the wrong block. Bear with me. There we go. I've got the outer bezel. I've got the inner bezel. In theory, they're close to similar sizes. In practice, the inner one is far too small because I can manually put it in there, right? I need to stretch this enough that I have to hammer it in place. I'm also going to need to actually, this is a case where I have to actually clean up my filing corners. So I'm going to trim them as close as I can with shears. And then I'm going to actually clean up the whole outer layer of this. As close as I'm going to get with shears. So first task is filing all my excess off. This is again, only the inner bezel that I'm doing this to, not my outer wall. And I want to just take the corners down where they crossed over. What I was saying is that although we hold off on sanding the exterior of the bezel, we do need to clean up the interior frame because we need to make it clean enough to be snugly fitted inside. It's our last chance to clean the outside of the inner bezel. So all I'm doing is trimming all the corners back by filing them clean. And then I'm also going to sand down my surfaces to make them nice and level. Because we don't have another chance to resize the inside frame. So we need a nice even wall that we're going to rest our stone on. Let me just double check we are recording good. Okay. So again, I'm changing directions periodically, so I'm not over filing or sanding one side or the other. My goal is just to get a nice level wall all the way around. Check the measurements on that. Not quite even. I've got a little bit of a dip in the middle, so I'm going to continue to sand this one down. If you find that you are having a hard time getting your inner wall the right size for inside, it's okay to make it taller than you would want and let it hang off the bottom when you're soldering. It just means you're a little more challenged to get it positioned exactly where you want it on the inside, because the hanging over, you're going to have to just sort of ballpark that you fitted it, solder it, and then trim the excess away. Whereas the benefit of having it the right height is when we tuck it in there, it's flush to the bottom, so we can really tell how tall our bezel is sitting. A little bit wonky on the corners still. I'm going to do just a little bit of cleanup on each wall to make sure that my walls are as smooth as possible for letting the solder flow between them. No curves in there or anything. And now it is time to check the fit as it stands and see just how much stretch and in what directions I need to stretch. So I have a little bit of length and a fair amount of width that I need to expand this. So I'm using the squeezy technique that we learned on the earlier bezel, which is either your half round pliers, if they haven't escaped, or if you're having trouble getting enough squeeze with that, the flat round. You can use round pliers, but you're going to get bumps throughout everything, and that won't be, it'll give you more gapping when you're trying to solder and so on. Also remember that you're always doing from both sides. I just have to figure out which side I already did. There we go. So from both top and bottom, when you do a squeeze, you want to do it from both sides. Otherwise, you're going to start tipping one side wider than the other. So it'll become sort of a parallelogram. I'm going to just do a bunch of squeezes, stretch this out, and it check often because it's easy to oversize. And then you have to make the interior frame again because it's not something you can shrink back down. This also gives you your hand workout for the day. Check my length, see how it's doing. Getting closer on one side, but not the other. Backwards. Still super loose. I'm gonna have to switch up to flat rounds, I think. Get a little more movement going. And remember that by doing this kind of squeezing, you are work hardening the piece. So occasionally, if you're really having to stretch it, you may need to anneal in the middle of the process. Got a ways to go. Start doing some side to side on the. I may get desperate and go to those round pliers. Get more squeeze. So at times I've had to spend 20 or 30 minutes getting this fit right. Don't be surprised if your first few shoulder bezels take that kind of time or more. Just know that you get faster at it as you learn the tolerances and what it really means to make a tight fitting bezel. But shoulder bezels are the basis for a whole lot of other cool decorative bezels. So getting good at them, you're going to get, there's a reason he spent a whole lot of time on this chapter. There's a lot of variants you can do. Okay, that's working us a little faster. So got one side doing pretty well. Side needs lengthening further.
Rachel, is a rectangle mandrel useful in this?
So the answer is maybe, because rectangles come in all different proportions. So if you have the exact right proportions, you could put it on a bezel mandrel and, you know, hammer stretch it a little bit or something. But just like with anything other than round, you know, teardrops and stuff like that are you're gonna find you don't have the perfect fit, which may make things worse, not better. Absolutely, if you're having trouble squaring things up, or if you've got really super well calibrated stones and the equivalent mandrels, go for it. And there's other techniques for making these kinds of forms. For example, there are punches, you know, presses for you hammer down into a form and compress metal into the shape you want. Those tend to be for angled versions of shoulder bezels. John talks about them a little bit in the book, and so I'll pull out my block for that when we get to that part of the chapter and do one or two of those. But yeah, there's a lot of this that's just so fiddly specific to the stone, the individual stone, that the bezel's not going to save you. So we are getting super, super close. I don't know if you guys can see, but I've still got gapping. And so I need it to be much harder to put into the frame than it is right now. So I could have made this a smidge bigger to start with and made my life a little easier. So as I'm doing this, what I'm trying to do is not hit the same exact spots I did already. So I'm more consistently thinning across the frame. I'm not thinning all in one area with my squeezes. Getting there. It's making it a little harder to set in, but I still want a bit more. Sure, it's not better on one side than on the other. That happens too.
So, Rachel,
Yeah.
in the book, it also it talks about the double to solder a second one. Is it kind of doing the same thing?
So you're talking about method 2 that we have on page 67.
Yeah, on the top.
Yep, we're gonna do a version of that after this. You'll discover that that is harder for several shapes.
Okay.
It's much harder for cornered things. But I think what I'm hoping to do is finish this one and then just show how to make that strip as the final step of today. I'm hoping we can get that far.
Okay, because visually I would think, but I don't know. I haven't done it, so that's why I was questioning of whether or not it's easier to go that route.
So it swaps the hard part. It makes it less of this fiddly stuff, but
Right.
more of precision sizing. So the benefit of this one was that we were able to do this soldering thing, right? Where we overshot our amount and we just cornered. That makes it much easier to fit around your stone. When we get to making the walls, we have to actually do that filing corner angle perfect fit on every corner, and it becomes harder because of that. But you'll find, for me, it's harder. You may find the reverse is true and having the strip is easier, especially because you can buy pre-made bezel strip that's step bezeled. Pardon?
Yeah, I was also wondering about that as well.
Yeah. Downside is it only comes in certain sizes. So if you have a large or unusually sized stone, and it tends to have a fairly slopey plane on that second part on the step. So I don't like the way that a stone sits in it as much. You can graver something out. You can cut a seat a little bit better. It just doesn't. I've never liked it. I've got some of it and I probably haven't touched it in 15, 20 years because it just doesn't do the same job.
Okay. So
That's my personal take on it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Now we're talking. Now we're in snug. All right. So now I'm having to fight it a little bit to get it even thinking about getting into the bezel, which is good. In John's emulation, he does a really hyper exaggerated, you have to like put a bend in your sidewalls to get it to go in. It's not necessarily quite as exaggerated as he has it in that drawing, but it'll make the difference in how you get it jammed in there. But before we do that curving to get it stuffed in there, what do? We need to file off whatever our top edge is going to be. Wow, I have really distorted the height of this piece by squeezing it that much. Give me a minute. I need to trim this back. So I've got much wider at one end than at the other. So I need to level this out a little bit. So what I was describing was we need to file the outer edge of the wall that is being stuffed in so that we have that flow gap for our solder, but not until I make this a more consistent size. Just that one corner, extra tall. Handy dandy flat file. Take some of this corner off. All right, and then I'm going to take down the upper wall at the edges. So I'm just putting an angle to give me room for the solder to flow. And I notch off the corners at the same time. So it's all got room all the way around. And that's going to be the end that I'm putting into the outer wall. And if I've sized it well, it's going to be a tight fit. Super tight, wrong direction. Enough so that I need to tap it in there. And if you can't, if it's really, really tight, what John's describing is he pushes in one long wall to give it a little bit more room, and then you squeeze it closed. That tells you that you're really, really snug. My little mallet. So I may want to take it out and get it a little bit wider still, because I'm getting gapping, which is where we got stuck the last trim, the last session on my oval. So yeah, it's gonna be fun. Gets harder and harder to put in and out after you stretch it. But if you know, if you've got it in there so snugly that you can't get it back out, then you're in great shape. So my outer walls need a little tiny bit more stretch. Or my long walls. Remember which side I filed. That makes me a little happier. Still a little bit gappy though. Short wall that needs some work. I know this part is exciting as watching paint dry, but it's the magic that we need to do to get it to be cleanly fitted. That's making me a little happier. Don't still see light through it, so I have it flipped. A sec, my machine is telling me I need to hit OK to the recording. Is there a rectangle mandrel? There is rectangle mandrels by Barbara, if you haven't left already. So rectangle mandrels, one of my favorite sets is this set of tiny multi-shapes that are used for bezel making specifically, but also can be used for chain making and so on. I know that Statura Gems used to sell them, and I've seen them, I think, more recently at Auto Fry. I'll try to pop a link up on the Facebook group for those. One more time out and back in. But again, rectangle mandrels are only as good as the proportions of whatever rectangle you're working with. So you won't find necessarily the perfect mandrel for your shape. Take my filed side. Filed side. Okay. So I have now positioned the inner wall snugly. I want to check that my stone is still happy at the height that I've got it, which may require figuring out which direction the stone goes. This stone is ever so slightly wider at one end than the other, causing a little bit of pain. Okay, so because I measured carefully when I was starting, I can leave my wall, I'm out of camera, I can leave the wall flush to the bottom and still give myself room for this setting. Stone is ever so slightly looser than I would like it to be, but we'll live with that. So I've now got a snug fit all the way around. I'm popping back over to the bench. And because it's snug, it should stay solidly in there and not slip. If you see it slipping when you're going to solder this part, then you did not make it snug enough to begin with. And we're working from the back of the piece to get, again, hard solder flowing down all of these crevices. And we hope that we don't have seam splits, because I don't want to have to remake again. So heating up and finding my hard solder. Be generous with this soldering, because you really want it to flow not only in the walls of into the wall at the point you're putting the solder down, but you also want to have it flow all the way through to the other side, so that you would see it as a clean seam line if you were looking at inside the bezel from the top. So I'm putting a fair large chunk of solder. And then I'll sometimes go back and do more if I see that it hasn't filled my creases of the seam. So I'm trying to get it to flow between the two walls without opening anything else that I've done up. Just sort of wants to soak in there a little bit more than that. What I'm looking for is, do I still see any gapping, or can I see the shine of the solder flow between the seams? It's a little hard to do too much on this. And then I'm checking the front to make sure that I can see my solder flow all the way around. See a little bit of gapping. So I'm going to put some solder in from this side. Cheat it a little bit because I've got that space I can fill in. And I've got a not 100% perfect corner fit on one upper corner. It just was probably I squeezed so much that I torqued one side taller than the other. I'm seeing if I can get it to flow a little bit in there. It's a little better. Again, taking the time to do it right means you don't have to cheat it. So we're in decent shape there with a bezel that now has a step I can set things on. I'm going to pickle this and do a lot of sanding and cleanup, and then choose how I'm going to corner it. What I mean by that is John describes a couple different ways to set a corner of a stone. In any case, if you're doing faceted, you're going to want to drill out the walls. The corners rather, excuse me. Drill little holes to make room for the corner of your stone. Oh, come on, Zoom meeting, don't get stuck on me. There we go. So if you have faceted stones, take a ball burr at each corner interior and just put a little divot there. Cancel that. Hang on a sec. My Zoom is behaving badly. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, good. So you get to the corners. You're going to take a tiny little drill, round burr, ball burr rather, and put a corner hole in there so that when you have a sharp facet that hits the corner, what you're doing is leaving room for when you bend the metal over it so it doesn't hit, the pressure of the metal doesn't hit that corner. When we get to actually doing some setting with these, I'll give a better demonstration of that. But that is now, that's our first of the step bezels on corner pieces. And when you're finishing it, one of your choices is to finish with cutting away or filing away the corners. It makes a nice little curved look to it, like a bread basket. Let me bring that to the better camera. Show better. So this is doing the cutaway curved corners instead of straight and folded over. So this is the same exact bezel we just built, just with cornering and giving a little curve to it. But you can play with this. You can do all kinds of different patterns around the edges. And this is the exact same step bezel style. Okay. Questions about that so far? Okay. Do we have the energy and the focus to make some of the strip bezel, or would you rather I hold that till next time and we do show and tell? I'm getting one vehement hold until next time. Anybody have strong feelings? Nobody's counting on that for their work at homes. Okay. I'll give you this clue if you do want to work ahead. Measure twice, cut once, but measure 73 times for each strip that you cut, and Anneal your material on both pieces before you flatten them down. Get them nice and flat, and then use a series of those T-pins to set them up. So what I'm gonna show you a mock-up of what I mean by that when you're layering on your material, so that if you do want to try just following along in what the book is, it'll give you a good setup for it. You're gonna make your wider piece. You're gonna make your narrower strip. So this could be 22 gauge and this could be 24, for example. And you're gonna make sure that they both have completely evenly measured walls. Okay. Oop. Hold please. Nolan, Leanne. Is that you asking something? I can't hear you if you're talking, Leanne. Maybe that wasn't for me. Okay, I'm gonna keep going unless I hear otherwise on my screen. We're making a strip for the outer wall and a narrower strip for the inner wall, and getting them completely evenly sized and flat and well filed is key. So flattened this way and flattened on all their edges. And then when you're setting up to solder, if you have a boatload of those T-pins, you can make a row against which the edge that meets should line up. And then you make another T-pin wall that you push diagonally across it like this, tipped across, so that it helps position it and force it into place. And then you're going to use little bits hanging over the edge. So make your thin strip a little bit wider than your wide strip. I didn't say that well. Your interior wall, make it a little bit longer on each end, because then it gives you a little corner spot where they meet that you can push in to make sure it doesn't move. I'm going to draw that one for you because I can tell it's not showing up well on the angle I've got my camera. And that'll let you guys play around if you want to try it before I demo it next time. So we have the strip of what will become our outer wall that is thick. Make your inner wall hang over the edges a little bit. Okay. And then put one of your T-pins at the juncture and a row of them here. And what that does is it positions it, it holds it in place so that you're completely flush against the bottom edge. And this keeps it from moving around. You're then going to put your little solder bits along the join of the two of them and get it to flow underneath to the wall. Okay, so those are the steps that I found make this position not wobble, like otherwise it's going to go all squiggly on you as the solder flows and that sort of thing. Okay, so that's my clue for that. Let me grab my notes so I can remind myself what we will be doing next time. And I will paste the various links that are helpful. My next class coming up that's an actual class is 3 clasps and maybe more in 3 days. If you're interested in that, it's some really cool shaped clasps that we're doing. Come on, little Zoom, behave. Bear with me a sec while I get my notes up and get my links up. Zoom's decided it's on time delay. Okay. So here's a boatload of links for you if they come out in the chat. And next up, we will be covering that version 2. So we're going to be doing the wall, the pre-built wall that I was just starting to lay out. We will build one of those walls and then show the challenges of fitting a cornered piece when you're using the pre-built wall, because it has some different challenges. I'm either going to do an oval and then a square or rectangle. I may just do the rectangle that I just did, making it the other way, or I may do a faceted square stone. I gotta decide which one. I have some really lovely square faceted stones, but they're so small, I'm not sure you guys will be able to see them well. After that, we are going to go back to method 1, which is building the 2 parts, and do a triangle and then a pear or teardrop shape, pear shop shape. So not a full round teardrop, but a traditional pear shape. We are unlikely to get to the marquee until the session after that. So if you want to play along at home, either cabs or faceted stones. And then we hit the dreaded emerald cut a couple sessions from now, and that'll probably take a session unto itself at least. Emerald cut gets a lot more challenging and works somewhat backwards of what we've been doing here. Any questions? Any show and tell? Any, here's what I've been working on? You want to show, Carmen? Yes, please. I'm gonna, wait a sec, let me share screen, pin people appropriately. I just have to remember how to unpin me. There we go, remove spotlight. Okay, what do you got for us?
Well, I was trying to do the triangle, and then you told me one of the problems that I was having, why it wasn't soldering, was because it was all brass.
Yep.
And this is the one I said that, you know, it didn't really matter because I cut the back and you can't really see the bezel I did in front.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Yeah, I said, so it's not that you shouldn't be able to solder brass, it's that it's going to fight you a lot harder than silver will, because it wants to tarnish faster than a silver will, and so and silver is pretty fast. So you're constantly battling, and you need more heat for brass. So you're constantly battling the, can I do it fast enough to not blacken so that the solder will stop flowing?
Yeah, I noticed how you use the big torch. I have one of those, but I was melting everything, and I ended up getting a small Smith little torch.
The mini?
The mini, because I felt like I can control it.
Yep.
I mean, I ended up getting gauge tips for it because the mini was just too many. I don't even know how to explain it.
Yeah.
So then I added the gauge tip. So I'm very comfortable with it. But when every time I see you solder, I just like can't breathe because I think you're going to melt it. That's what happened to me. But of course, you're the expert.
So no, so I'm a different skill level with the kind of torch I have, is the way I would put it. It's going to be about practice. I started on an acetylene torch, and an acetylene gas by itself. If you're doing a Smith, you're using oxygen and something. What are you using? Oxyacet?
Yes.
So if you were using oxyacet with a bigger torch, it's much, much hotter than just an acetylene air. So it's not surprising that you melt things. It's used for smelting for the sake of casting and so on. So it's not as easy to control. It's used differently. It doesn't mean one or the other is right or wrong. When I work big, I want a big torch for sure for the surface coverage. And when I'm working on delicate, small focused things or gold, I needed the smaller Smith torch. You need the small tip for the control. But that looks gorgeous. I'm excited that you started out with a triangle, which is one of the tougher ones. So that's great.
I didn't know. I mean,
it's all good.
mean, it kind of split here, but I was able to solder it. Like now I have the parallel plier now. So now I know, but because when I was trying to bend it, at one point it was round, like it shows in the book.
Yep.
And then at another point, when I got it perfect, I was trying to, maybe it got work hard, but it broke.
Yep. So brass is also harder to get it fully annealed because of its material. But also if you got a round, this is something John mentions in the book, if you get something rounded when you try to make your corners, it's probably that you did not go far enough through on your filing. Get closer to the 2/3 filed through than the 1/3.
Yeah,
right?
I'm pretty happy with it.
It looks great.
Thank
Anybody
you.
else? Any works in progress you want to share? Any wins or discoveries? Or we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes, folks.
I have one of those.
Nice. Tell us about it.
I'm still back at the round stone, I have my piece that I measured 3.5 and it was never large enough. I've been stretching the whole time. I finally remember the technique I learned from Marnie Ryan, where I use a metal hammer on the rim of the ring, I guess,
Yep,
and slide it along the mandrel.
nice.
And I started to get a little more movement. And I reached the point where the stone could get stuck. Unfortunately, this stone, gorgeous stone, I don't know, it's a piece of glass.
Yep.
I inherited jeweler's box of beautiful glass gems. Of course, I was never told they were glass, but it's pretty obvious. You know, it's a 6 millimeter, an 8 millimeter tourmaline is not something you just find in a plastic box.
Right, right. So you got it sized up enough?
I think I just have to file it now because it's got a burr on it and then it'll go through properly.
Nice, very nice. So the trick about pushing it down the mandrel, the one thing I would add to the way that you've been doing it is use not a metal hammer, but use a mallet, either a wood or a rawhide, because by hitting it with a steel on steel, you are actually compressing the metal downward when you do that. So you're changing the height of the bezel you made. But if you do it with a mallet, it's steel on steel stretches silver, wood or mallet on steel sizes it. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. That's a great one. Delrin.
Leather mallet, and I had the plastic mallet. This is the Delrin mallet. It was shredding. Until I put the metal one on it, this thing wasn't moving.
All right. Yeah, sometimes the tool is what the tool is. If it works for you, it works. That's great. Nice.
That's been my amusement. And I have annealed repeatedly.
Yep. Got it. And you're working with sterling, right? Not argentium or anything? Okay,
No, sterling.
cool. Well, you'll get there.
I will.
Nice. Anybody else have something they want to share?
I have a question.
Sure.
I started doing the nail things
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't have the other part to put on the handle, but you had mentioned something about it splitting and to get the handle. Now what's splitting? It's going to come through here?
Yeah.
Or is it going to go in there?
Yep. So think about it. Sometimes you're going to be using a lot of force, downward force on it with your hands, or sometimes you would use a hammer, but not often with these. And as you do that, it's going to force the point of the nail that you put in there up through it. And so it could slip and crack on you. It could jam through. It's especially bad when we're doing gravers because they're so sharp. But even with a nail, you could push it out the back and through your hand if you suddenly get a push. So the band around it doesn't do a lot, but it does just enough to hold the thing from splitting. So you'll get a chance to move your hand as you feel it happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. 'Cause I
Especially
just
critical for the
temporarily
grave.
Put it in there.
Yeah,
But it works.
It does. Yeah. No, that's great. And it looks like you sized that one in particular really well for your hand.
Yeah, I wasn't doing really well with.
Yeah. No, the little guy is probably closer. So this is about when you put it in the palm of your hand, you should just be able to grab it with the first and like as if you're holding a pencil, basically. So it should, yeah. You've got a great size there.
Trying to do that.
Yep.
But this one was from the nail.
Nice. And that polished up nicely. Good. Have you been using them for setting?
I did. I used
Cool.
it in another setting, and so I'm starting to kind of get the idea as to why
Yeah.
you have them.
Nice. And you can play around with the shapes and sizes that you like. You know, my favorite is a sort of an elongated rectangle that's been blunted just out at the edges. So it's got a slight curve to each edge. That's what I tend to use.
I did this one too.
Nice.
Like a flat.
Yeah, and so that, if you do that kind of a finish on the other end of one of those nails, but don't put it in a handle, then that's a setting punch. That's what we're talking about with, so John does the, when you're doing the upright on a heavier bezel and you're just tapping with a hammer, that's what you do, what you make those out of.
So I can.
Without the,
make
without the
it-
handle, without the handle. So,
Okay.
so top, do the same kind of finish you did on that one, but on the shorter end of the nail, and you'll have a good setting punch.
Okay, on the opposite. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
All
I
right.
was pretty, I didn't know you can do this with a nail.
Yeah, just the tools that you can make for yourself are great. And I'll, at some point I'll pull out a bezel rocker that I hate using bezel rockers. I was taught to use them wrong when I was first taught to use them for setting. And Chris Plouffe, who does all the great Mokame Gane rings, showed me a modification that made me fall in love with them again. So I'll show that on another session. Anybody else have other questions or show off or success, failure, learning experiences? All right. Next time, fancier shapes. In the meantime, enjoy your process and join the Facebook group if you haven't and you want to get some of those forms. And there's a couple links that I'll pop up there when I dig them out. I think I owe people rose cut dealers if I don't already have them in the Facebook group. And there was something else I promised to post. What was the other thing that I said I would post you guys links for? The Statura or wherever the bezel mandrels are. So the set of mandrels that I was talking about, I'll try to post some access points for that. Okay. Have a good one. See you in a couple weeks. Happy making.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.